ashamed to hold my Lord, nor to defend his cause. Maintain the honors of his word, the glory of his cross.
This evening we are on page 22 of our books. We're in the final week of lesson 4, dealing with difficulties that arise from translations. So far we've talked about, last week we talked about inadequate translations. In other words, where a word was not translated properly. We've talked about how sometimes our versions we use archaic language that's old, and where our language has moved on. And then, of course, we talked about just errors in translation. These aren't where the wrong word was used. This is where a scribe made a mistake in one of the earlier manuscripts, and that got passed down. And it got into our translations, and people sometimes ask, well, why didn't they fix it? If they know it's an error, why didn't they fix it? And the answer to that is because if someone later comes up and makes a fix, they're making the fix as to what they believe the right answer is. However, if the fix that they made was wrong, then all future translations that might be made off the fixed translation will be wrong too. And so most of the time our translators choose to leave those errors in. They might make note of it in the references at the bottom and tell us that not all these manuscripts have this word, or some say this or some say that. And it's because that there isn't a conspiracy out there about translations. People did know what they're translating, and sometimes even know, yes, that does create a conflict. But that shouldn't shake our faith, because we can know what the Word of God actually says by reading it. Well, that brings us down to point 4. Difficulty transcribing numbers. I was a math teacher when I taught, among other things, when I was teaching in public school, taught math and science. And so, having graded math tests for many years, I know that sometimes when a kid puts a wrong answer down on the page, it's because they copied it off their calculator incorrectly. Or they did something in their head and they wrote the wrong number down. Instead of writing 112, maybe they wrote 121. They flipped the number. And you can sometimes find those mistakes. Those are what we call silly mistakes, but they're hard mistakes to find. Because invariably, our brain, when we believe we've written something down correctly, we can sometimes see what should be on the page is correct, even if it's incorrect. And that's why we don't edit our own work. Whenever you're writers have other editors come and edit their own work, or come and edit their work. Why? Because our brain has the ability to say, I know what I meant to say, but I may not have written that word down. I might have used an incorrect there, like there, T-H-E-R-E, T-H-E-I-R, T-H-E-Y apostrophe R-E. Our brain can fix a lot of things and can fill in some pieces that are missing. So if you're missing a word, our brain can sometimes, as we're reading along, fill in the missing word, even if it's not on the page. And so we know this because we write numbers down with numerals. However, that's not always the way numbers were written down. Moreover, when we write numbers, if I was to ask you how many people attended the Santa Claus parade in downtown Toronto, how would you give me that number? About. Because no one really counted the number. What are those numbers? What do we call those types of numbers? Pardon me? Approximations or estimations. And the way people go about estimating is they take a look. Okay, we can take a look at the crowd. We know approximately how many people fit on a block. We see that the place is full, and so we're going to count the number of blocks, and we'll take an estimate of how many people. Now, how accurate are our estimates? Well, it depends. It depends. Sometimes it all is based on what our assumption was. If we come along and say, okay, 100 people will fit in a little block, but if on that day there was 200 people that fit on that block, well, that's a big an undercount. But that could come along and say, okay, you've estimated half as many people were actually there. But however, if we said 100 people fit on a block, and there were actually 115, we're off by 15% of the crowd. We've only estimated 85% of the crowd, and so when you start extrapolating out to big numbers, your error is it can get quite large quite quickly. But when numbers are given, sometimes we run into problems transcribing numbers when we're dealing with approximate numbers. Let's go and get a couple verses. Matthew chapter 14, verse 21. And that can be Naomi. And Tammy can get Acts chapter 2, verse 41. And Bill, Acts chapter 4, verse 4. Acts chapter 14, verse 21.
And those who ate were about 5,000 men besides women and children.
Okay, and then Acts 2:41.
And those who gladly received his word were baptized, and that day about 3,000 souls were added to them.
And then Acts chapter 4, verse 4.
But many of those who had heard the message believed, and the number of the men came to be about 5,000.
Okay, so we understand these aren't verses that have problems in it. What these verses are meant to establish is that the Bible uses approximations when it gives numbers. Sometimes it can approximate things, and we understand that. Naomi's verse said, we call this the feeding of the 5,000 in Matthew 14. It said about 5,000 men besides women and children. So we already know that 5,000 is only counting the men, and it's an approximation of men, but there were women and children. Now, I'm not saying everyone was married, but say you had everyone married. Well, now you have 10,000 people. If they all had one child, that's 15,000 people. Now, not everyone was going to be married, but not everyone was going to also have one child. So you could easily be dealing with between 12 and 15,000 people in the crowd. Well, we call this the feeding of the 5,000. We understand, though, that that's an approximate. Just as we understand that about 3,000 were baptized in Acts 2, and about 5,000 was that the number came to at the end of Acts 4. Peter wasn't standing there taking roll, saying, "Oh, there's exactly 3,000." That would be very strange if there was an exact number and we're talking about a number this large. The whole point of the story is a lot of people became Christians. The reason why we have to know that is when it comes to how long Israel was in slavery for, we get two different answers, or it appears that we have two different answers. Henry, you want to get Genesis 15, verse 13, and then Naomi, Exodus chapter 12, verse 41. Genesis 15, verse 13.
Then he said to Abraham,
No, certainly your descendants shall be strangers in a land that is not theirs. Your sole reign will afflict within 400 years.
All right. So how long would Israel be inflicted slavery for? 400 years. All right. Exodus chapter 12, verse 41.
At the end of 430 years, on that very day, all the hosts of the land went out from the land of Egypt.
All right. How long was Israel in Egypt for? 430 years. People come along and say, ha ha, God predicted 400. Israel was in, it said 430 years. Now, it could be that this is an approximation. Could be. However, and of course that would be an approximation, like as far as we can understand, okay, the Bible was rounding off the number 400 years. I would come along, you're sort of stuck at 430, you're stuck. It's not quite 450. To round it up to 450, you're rounding it, you're making time a little longer. Rather than, when we usually approximate years, we usually don't go over the amount if it's going to be that much over. That's going to be 20% more time. So you can come along and say, well, maybe the writer of Genesis, like as far as maybe God was just rounding it approximately 400 years, and 430 years would fit into that. However, when I do have one thing to note on that, and that has to do with how long Jacob was in Egypt. If we go back to Genesis chapter, I think it's 46. I'm trying to find the verse, and I shouldn't try to do this, but at any rate, it's when he comes before Pharaoh. When I'm trying to tell how old Jacob was. There it is. In Genesis 47 and verse 9. Tammy, you want to get Genesis 47 and verse 9.
Jacob said to Pharaoh, the days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Even evil have been the days of the years of my life. And they have not seen the days of the years of the life of my fathers, and the days of their pilgrimage.
Okay, so how old was Jacob when he came down to Egypt? He was 130. Does anyone remember how old he lived? It was a different number. Abraham lived 170 years. Isaac lived 175 years. Isaac lived 180 years, I think. Jacob lived to be 147. That's how old he was when he died, and I can't find the verse that says it. I know it was 147 though. How long that, if he came to Egypt when he was 130 and died at 147, how long did Jacob live in Egypt? "17 years. Were Israel slaves when Jacob lived in Egypt? No, they weren't. So, Genesis 15 said that they're going to be afflicted for 400 years. Well, if Israel had been in Egypt for 430 years, and Jacob was there for 17 of those years, we now know that there are 413 years until until Israel left Egypt. And if you listen to my Genesis and Exodus podcast, I do come along and make a point. There's a difference between Jacob's burial and Joseph's burial. Jacob, when Jacob died, he was basically mummified, and they brought him back to Canaan. Joseph, after that, lived another 60 years. When Joseph died, they didn't bring his bones back to Shechem right away. He charged Israel, when you leave here, you're going to take my bones with you. Now, I asked the question. It's one I don't have a positive answer for, but I asked the question, why? Jacob was, what they were able to bring Jacob's bones back to the cave of Machpelah right away after the 40 days of mourning. Joseph had to wait almost 300 years. Why? And what I suggest is that even though the affliction that we read of in the days of Moses wasn't there yet, that the pharaohs in Egypt had changed, that there was a change in dynasty probably somewhere. And Joseph in Israel, being that they weren't Egyptians, were probably not treated as nicely even during Joseph's lifetime. We often read the Pharaoh that knew not Joseph as if Joseph had been dead for years. Well, it doesn't take that long, especially as someone gets older, for the younger generation just to not know what the older generation did, even while they're still alive. And so what I had suggested was there isn't really a conflict between Genesis 15 and Exodus 12, because Israel really was afflicted for 400 years. And it started during the days of Joseph, but after the power that Joseph had dissipated. In other words, a king changes. Every time rulers change, we see it in England. Different people have the ear of the king when you have new kings. And as Joseph had died and really been forgotten, then of course it got worse and worse and worse. And so it appears that even by the time Joseph died, that something was going on with Israel that meant that they just couldn't freely go and bring Joseph's bones back to Shechem, where he wanted them buried. And that's a suggestion of food for thought for you to think of. But at the very least, we know the Bible approximates numbers. Of course, then we also have sometimes we have mistranslation of numbers. A number referred to in one Old Testament account sometimes differs from that which recorded in another account. And the Hebrew language, though, is the reason for that. The Hebrew language, we use numerals. But when kids are first introduced to numbers, I don't know if they still do, when I was writing, you had to take a number in numerals and translate that into words. You still do that, right, in the lower grades? Where they have like the number 100 and you have to write 100. You don't know. You teach grade 8. So it used to... okay, there you go. But it's very easy. They didn't have numerals like we do. They always wrote their numbers out. And they didn't have the words like we did. They had symbols. Like as far as they had the symbols writing of Asian type writing. And if you're not careful, some of those letters, some of those numbers can look awfully similar. And if you're reading, even if you're doing it very carefully, you might have a pen stroke that is a little long or a little short, and it's mistranslated later. And so the question that the writer puts in point 2 is, how could 40,000 stalls in one verse in I think it's 1 Kings be reconciled with the parallel passage in 2 Chronicles where it says 4,000 stalls? The first passage in 1 Kings 4:26 says Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses of his chariots and 12,000 horsemen. In 2 Chronicles 9:25 of the same story, Solomon had 4,000 stalls for horses and chariots and 12,000 horsemen whom he stationed in chariot cities and with the king at Jerusalem. And so, even in our language, 4,000 and 40,000, we can see how that might be miscopied. So in other words, someone writes 4,000, or someone meant to write 4,000, and they put an extra 0 on it. But in the Hebrew language, the number 40,000 looks very similar to the number 4,000. So we have to ask ourselves which one is right. Is it 4,000 or 40,000. And if you read the rest of the context, the ratio of horses to chariots is much more reasonable in the account of 2nd Chronicles, that lower number. 4,000 stalls of horses. And so we can make that judgment. Now perhaps we're wrong. And 2nd and 1st Kings is the right number, and 4,000, where they dropped a 0, was right. The point is, Solomon had a lot of horses for chariots. Had a lot of horses for chariots. But the point is not to know exactly the right number. That's not the most important point. But we can make a judgment on that. Because it's not central to the story, we can make a judgment on that and say which one seems more reasonable. We do that all the time. When you have two pieces of literature and one obviously has a copying error, which one sounds more reasonable? Which one sounds like it is right? Then we had, he gives other examples. How many people did David kill in 2 Samuel 10:18? It says, then the Syrians fled before Israel, and David killed 700 charioteers, 40,000 horsemen, and struck Shobach, the commander of the army, who died there. Verses 1 Chronicles 19, and the Syrians fled before Israel, and David killed 7,000 chariots and 40,000 foot soldiers of the Syrians, and killed Shobach, the commander of the army. So it's the difference between 700 and 7,000. And when you go down and you read his explanation here, what is being described there? Forgetting the number especially, what is being described in those verses? Yeah, like as far as what's the author trying to get across in the story? That David killed them. Pardon me?
And he killed a lot.
And he killed a lot of people. So he won a significant victory. But which one is more likely to be right? 700 or 7,000? Why do you believe that? It's one person, okay. 740,000 horsemen of the Syrians, but when you have 700 charioteers and 40,000 horsemen versus 7,000 charioteers and 40,000 foot soldiers, yeah, you're right. You're saying probably we're talking the 1,000 and the 100 is obviously the mistake here, and it is in all probability the Chronicles is right, and the Samuel's number should be corrected to agree with it. But that is, we could be wrong. We ask ourselves which one is more reasonable. Seems to me 700 is more reasonable than 7,000. However, God was with David, so 7,000 isn't impossible. The point of the story is not to tell us exactly how many David killed. We need to know he had a significant victory. And then, of course, in point C, we have additional information. Why are 24,000 said to have died at Baal Peor? Well, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 8 reports it as 23,000. Who reads next? Who read last? You read last? So, Bill, you want to get 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 8. And verse 8.
Nor are we to commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. 23,000 in one day.
Okay, so what does 1 Corinthians chapter 10 tell us about how many who died? 23,000 in what? In one day. So 1 Corinthians speaks of the number of people who died in a single day. When you go back to Numbers 25, which is the story that is being referred to, Numbers refers to the total number of casualties. If 23,000 died in one day, and there were 24,000 casualties, how many died on other days? 1,000. It's not a difficulty if we read the actual passage. Paul is affirming that 23,000 died, because we know that at least 23,000 died. But Paul's saying 23,000 died on one day. And so 1 Corinthians chapter 10 refers to those who were killed by the sword as well as the plague. And Exodus 32:28 gives another number as well. And so we have to pay attention when it comes to numbers, that we're actually reading what the passage is telling us. Because sometimes we can do that cursory read where we think we know what the passage is saying, when it actually is not. When we actually haven't paid close enough attention. Saying that Paul said that 23,000 died, but missing that in one day, can make that very confusing when going back and saying 24,000, because both of those numbers are rounded off, but they're rounded to the nearest thousand, their nearest hundred, not the nearest thousand. So you can't come along and say, well, that's a rounding error, really it was around 20,000. No, 23,000 and 24,000 are pretty specific numbers, even if they're rounded off to the nearest hundred. And so there must be an explanation. There is an explanation. One's talking about total casualties. One's talking about dying in one day. And so pay attention to the numbers. Pay attention to the passage. If we do that, we won't run into problems. So sometimes we can run into numbers that were just copied wrong. Sometimes we can run into numbers where the numbers themselves are approximations. And we need to watch out for those. And sometimes we might be given additional information in numbers, and that goes there. So we need to recognize that numbers, a lot of the time, when we run into problems with numbers, we're dealing with one of those three categories. Either an approximation, might be a mistranslation of numbers, or we might need to pay a little closer attention to it. We've answered all the questions. We just finished the questions. I'd like us to quickly explore one of what was written down of our homework question. Explore the translation you normally use and find apparent contradictions known to your English version. So I have not heard any of these. So someone want to share one that they might have had? Sure. What do you got?
So Leviticus 11,
Okay.
and verse 13,
All right.
I use New King James.
All right. So you want Leviticus 11 verse 13. You want to read that?
And these you shall regard as an abomination among the birds. They shall not be eaten. The key there is the word bird.
Okay.
So then you go down to verse 19. It mentions a bat.
Oh, I see.
So the word there that's translated bird in the King James is translated fowl,
Okay.
and also in the King James in verse 20 where it starts talking about flying insects,
Yeah.
it says fowl there as well.
Okay.
So what I found was that two things: the Arabs actually classified bats as birds at the time,
Okay.
but also the word in the Hebrew is can be translated fowl, bird, or flying, has a wing.
Okay.
Is what it was, has a wing. So they probably should have gone with the fowl or a wing translation there instead of.
I see. I hadn't even thought of that. That was a pretty good catch. I do remind people that we classify animals differently than the way Scriptures does. And that gets into the evolution question. When a person who believes in evolution say, you don't believe that there are changes in any animals. So in other words, you go back to Darwin's finches. And you say, well, it showed Darwin's finches change. And I said, those are still finches. They might have had their beak thing might have changed. I don't deny that animals can adapt. Moths, the black and the white moth that they want to come along to, that's proof of evolution. No, that's proof of adaptation. Like as far as, I have no problem with an animal being able to adapt to its environment. We see that all the time. But we have defined species differently than the way the Bible talks about species and the way the Bible talks about animals. Our species and the Bible's species are not the same word. All dogs are dogs, but some dogs can't mate with one another. They're different breeds of dogs, but they're still dogs. They're not hippos, and they're not giraffes, and they're not human. They're still dogs. And so the Bible is a little bit more broad in what it puts into its kind, but generally speaking, kinds are the same types of animals. All cats would be a kind. And you'd have different species of cats, the way we classify them, yes. But you don't have, Noah didn't have to bring a black cat and a white cat and an orange cat and a black and white cat. And he doesn't have to bring up all those cats. He had to have cats that could reproduce. And that would be how Noah would have done it. But this goes to exactly the way what Tammy was saying, was that people say a bat's not a bird. And it's not. Is it a mammal? Is a bat a mammal? Bat's a mammal. They're saying, well, that's not a bird. And the Bible's wrong here. No. The Hebrew knew what they were talking about. It's just we've classified it differently. Do you have something, Bill?
Yeah, mine's kind of, it's contradiction, but the problem is context.
Okay. What's your verse?
In Jeremiah, I got the American Standard.
What's the verse, though, so I can say it into the mic?
Jeremiah 32 and verse 27.
So, Jeremiah 32:27, then I'll turn it to you, Bill.
Yes. God says, behold, I am the Lord. He's speaking to Jeremiah. He says, the God of all flesh. Is anything too difficult for me?
Okay.
So meaning Jeremiah that no, there's nothing too difficult for God. But in Judges chapter 1,
Okay. Go to Judges 1.
and verse 19.
And verse 19, okay.
Now it's being related that now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valleys because they had iron chariots.
Okay.
So at first thought, wait a minute, we've been told nothing's too hard for God, but now these iron chariots presented a problem to them.
Yeah. So what's the answer?
Well, the answer is the Lord was with Judah, but Judah didn't, in this particular case, they didn't do as they were told to do. So God left them on their own, and they couldn't drive out the inhabitants.
Yeah. Just because God was with them didn't mean that God miraculously did the work for them. That's what you're saying, right?
Right.
Anything else you want to add? No, you're good. I'm saying that's a good passage, because even without the Jeremiah passage, what people know about God say, well, how could Judah, how could the iron chariots have been a problem? And what you do have to read is through Judges 1, 2, and 3, and realize it was Israel's faith that prevented. They looked at the giants in the land. Remember back in Numbers, and they had a problem, even though God was with them. before they rebelled. God would have been with them, but they feared the giants. Well, if you take a look at the pictures of the land where Judah was going, you had this vast plain, and so you had all these chariots here, and you could take a look at it and say, wow, that's a lot of men. And obviously these people didn't have enough faith to go after them. God could have defeated even the chariots, but Judah had to have the faith. God told Israel that to go into the promised land back in the book of Numbers, and they rebelled. Even though God would have given it to them, they still had to have faith. And so, no, with anything, God can do anything, but he works through men. And men have to have faith in God and actually go out and do what they're told. If they won't, then God's not going to provide them victory. God's not going to provide them victory. I was even thinking about King Saul. I've been dealing with Saul's battle with the Philistines in 1 Samuel chapter 13. And he battles the Philistines and he makes a rash vow. And he tells his army to not eat all day. And he says, cursed be the person who eats all day. And Jonathan later, he didn't know about the vow. He took some honey and the people said, well, your father said we shouldn't eat all day. And basically, Jonathan said his father was foolish because the battle was incomplete. The people were hungry. They weren't fighting. But we know God was with them in the battle. But they still had to actually go out and fight. These people were hungry. The battle was not won as well, not because God was at fault, but because Saul made a rash vow. And so the battle was incomplete. The victory was incomplete. So, yeah, this is an example of faith. God was with the Israelites, but understanding the context, those are some pretty good things. Did you have something, Henry? Or I don't want to leave you out. You're
Same, yeah, New King James Version.
okay.
I haven't found.
Okay.
Yeah, I found some. It's really different versions.
Pardon me?
It's not this question.
Oh, not this
It's
question.
really different versions. I found.
I see. But those are some good food for thought.
I'm not ashamed to own my Lord.